All right, I'm here to talk today about shift right and observability. I think this is a good, we had a good lead in from QuickBase to talk about this because they've done obviously a very good job of shifting left. And I think that what we at SOS have noticed is that shift left has been gaining momentum and doing a lot for years. And we're we're following that trend. We're setting up some tools. I'll talk about those in a few minutes to help with the shift left initiatives that we see underway in the market. But we want to talk about is what we think, where we think the market is going 18 months, 2 years from now, maybe 5 years from now. This is like what we're calling internally the Horizon 2 area that we could be following at Sauce Labs, because we believe that, well, I'll just get into it. This is what the presentation's about. So what we're talking about is both shifting left and right. And I want to make sure everyone understands that I can't stand buzzwords, and I don't believe these are actually buzzwords. They're actually real. They are, it's a metaphor for earlier and later, but at the same time, it's not just a buzzword. They actually mean something. They're not just meaningless things we throw around. And when we say them, I want to make sure that everyone understands what we mean when we say them. I want to talk about also the loop, because the linear timeline that we always imagine a project undertaking from earliest to latest, or from requirements gathering to release, in my mind needs to be thought of more as a loop. It's a circle. It's not just a single linear process with a beginning and an end. I want to talk about observability, and to be clear, I'm not an expert in this. I would advocate anyone to follow Charity Majors on Twitter. She is sort of the one of the most knowledgeable people in the world right now about observability, and her company helps people with making their products more observable, more testable throughout the industry. And then I want to talk about how we're putting it into action here at Sauce Labs. We've already started, and it's great because when I first gave this talk, I was sort of giving it hoping that we would start to see action, and now we are actually doing it. And I'll talk about in some ways in which we are actually implementing some of these shift right and observability concepts at the moment. So, interesting. My bio slide didn't really show up. Evidently, I had some pictures on there that maybe it didn't like. So anyway, I'm the Senior Director of Field Services from Sauce Labs. I'm the chair of the Selenium Conference Organizing Committee as well. I'm also on the Project Leadership Committee for Selenium, as well as a contributor of code. I've been working with the Selenium tool since 2008. Around the time it debuted at GTAC in 2008, I've been using it now for 12 years. So heavily involved in the community. I'm 20 years in QA. I'm a tester for life, which I think is probably unusual, but becoming less and less so, which is great, very gratifying to me. I don't do too much on Twitter. Mostly I tweet, retweet other people, and I like family, music, and robots. I won't go into it too much. I don't have time. So I want to illustrate here what the traditional model. Most of us who have been in the industry for a long time, we see this linear model of a timeline that goes from requirements gathering all the way through design development, and then testing happens. And then there's this bottleneck of testing that you see. And it's a very common pattern, and I think you'll all agree with me that you've seen before, where things are going along, and then when a feature's ready to go and it's releasing in a couple of days, we have this slowdown where we say we need to finish all the regression testing, and it's usually a manual effort, something like that. Now, obviously, QuickBase has blown through this, but a lot of companies haven't quite turned that curve yet. I've worked for companies where we didn't release more than once a year, and the last 3 months of that are basically the process of testing and submitting bugs. I don't really feel like many people are doing that anymore for a year, but on a quarterly basis, our data show that quarterly is a more regular cadence. And so the last 2 or 3 weeks of the quarterly release cycle end up being this huge bottleneck where we're stuck on testing and we're waiting. And the shift left model is an attempt to pull that back, pull the testing effort back a little bit more towards the development, so that developers spend a huge amount of their time writing tests, and then QA spends a huge amount of their time working with developers to integrate those tests. But it just moves the bottleneck. That's what we've found, is that the bottleneck is now at the beginning rather than at the end, because developers who historically haven't naturally gravitated towards testing, they're forced to sort of stop half of their momentum, spend half of their time writing tests, and now QA is now waiting for the release to get to them before they start to work on it for shipping. And what we're trying to do is get to the point where it's just a constant rhythm. where within this, there are these cycles and these ups and downs, but it evens out ultimately to this flat process where ideally a developer works on a feature, the tester works there with them. If there is a tester, sometimes developer does all this themselves. And they go through these cycles of iteration, and then as soon as they release the software to or merge the software into master, within a few minutes, it gets shipped. That's the idea. That's what we're heading for, is the idea that testing isn't something that is ever holding up the process. It is a natural part that is woven into and stretched throughout the process. What we're after we can absorb that concept is the idea that when you're gathering requirements, you're gathering signals from real world user behavior based on both testing in production and testing of things like user analytics signals, stuff like that, that you can build into the requirements so that you factor these things in a constant feedback loop, so that when you're developing, you understand the user traffic model, you understand the click paths that your users are following, and then you have more trust and confidence in the requirements that product has given you, and you're not questioning them. Now, when you move through testing, you're adding tests to the automated suite based on the analytics gathered after the previous release cycle. And the difference there is, I always imagine, because I used to do this, that testers try to think through the ways they could break the software and think through ways you could do boundary testing. And if, I worked on a retail site for a long time where we were heavily search engine based, and you have this landing page that you land on when you search. You say, I want a coupon from Macy's, and it goes to the Macy's store page, and you find all the list of coupons for Macy's, and then you click on that, and we make sure that the attribution is tracked so that we get paid commission. But along the way, we started gathering information about users' profiles and their personal information, not much, but I mean, like a picture and an email address, stuff like that. We spend a huge amount of time in QA figuring out how we were going to test this profile management area. And what we were not factoring in this feedback loop is the fact that only 1% of our users ever went in there. 99% of our users just went to the page and clicked right out and went to Macy's. They never, but we spent huge amounts of hours and probably years working on testing things because we were not measuring user signal to tell us what we should and should not be spending all of our effort on. We should have been spending all of our effort working on all the different ways the algorithm that lists the coupons in particular order should be altered or enhanced based on other signals that we're getting from the system to cause lift and create better conversion paths from the funnel. So once we release the software, we should be factoring these user signals in as well, because they're going to change as a result of release. We need to be able to understand how we expect them to change and to be able to track whether or not they're changing as opposed as we modeled them. And we can do that with a lot of confidence if we build these things behind feature flags, which gives us a quick rollback ability if the model doesn't work out the way we think it did. So if you see the common thread in here, it is that we're now trying to look through how to anticipate, model, and then track the user behavior patterns that are exhibited through our application. And that as testers, we should be incorporating this kind of question and this kind of feedback into every test that we design. Of course, we need to test the profile page, but we don't need to spend thousands of hours on it. We need to spend tens of hours on it and spend thousands of hours optimizing the thing that actually makes us money. So where we're heading with this is building observability into the system, building user signal gathering through in the system, throughout planning, coding, testing, through user acceptance testing, through the release, through monitoring, and then very importantly, through maintenance. Because maintenance is the thing that we all have to account for, that we tend not to account for, because it always comes back to bite us. So shift left is the idea that we're taking testing effort and we're moving it back to the coding phase. Shift right is the idea that we're moving some of the tests to production to make sure that some of the pipelines that are in production aren't breaking at the time that we deploy. A lot of things can go wrong as you deploy to production, as we all know. And the more we do some kinds of testing there, or at least some observing there as after we release, the better we can bring those things back to the beginning. So we're going to try to bring this loop all the way back and say, we observed when we shipped that this change in behavior happened, and we need to make sure that we account for that in the future. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here. It's a feedback loop. We have to start using data that is driven by the signals that the users give us to generate and continue to validate the requirements of the software. This is a little bit of a paradigm shift from, I think, traditional testing, but it pays off. Let me give you a thought exercise about observability as we kind of move into this process, because I think we all know what monitoring is. Monitoring is watching signals that your system is emitting in order to be able to find out if there's a problem. And the thought exercise is this. Imagine this is, I believe it's an Oracle database monitor, and these little spikes in CPU usage are actually due to active sessions being tracked. What is this actually telling us? It is telling us that there are a lot of people using the system at certain parts of the day. But it's really not telling us much of anything. Like, we should start to expect more from a graph like this, because we should know more what is happening, what is going on in the user journeys. There's no reason we can't introspect a little bit more. So look at this graph a little bit more closely and think about, what if instead of telling us how many sessions there were and having a little tiny red line at the top there that probably indicates errors, how useful is this? What could this be telling us instead? Could this not be telling us the number of users who are currently being delighted by our system right now? And how do we know if they're being delighted? That's a subjective measure, isn't it? Well, some parts of the delighted concept aren't exactly objective. You could talk about things like cart abandonment if you're working in e-commerce. If you're going through a checkout flow and you abandon the cart right at the last minute before you enter your credit card, that's a user who you know is not being delighted. If they go through checkout flow and they're in checkout flow for more than about 6 minutes, that is a user who is not being delighted. Now, the problem might be on their end. They may have gotten distracted. They may have gotten a phone call. Not that people make phone calls anymore, but you can draw conclusions about behavior because we are already measuring signals about what users are doing and what click paths they're following and sort of the journey they're taking throughout our software. But these graphs, these traditional graphs that have been around forever, need a facelift and need a revamp. And we should, as testers, if I'm speaking to a group of testers, we should start to ask better questions of the monitoring that we get. I was at a customer site not terribly long ago before COVID happened, and I saw dashboards all over the system. They were beautiful, beautiful hexagonal dashboards that told you about the state of the system everywhere. And I asked one of the developers sitting near one of the dashboards, how often do you look at that dashboard? And he said, never. And I looked really, really, really closely at the dashboard, really, really close. I looked at it for 2 or 3 minutes to see if I could find something worth talking about. And everything was green, 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 green. And in the top right, I noticed that there was a little circle. It was a hexagon called DB pool connections. And it said 235/236. And there were presumably 235 little dots within the hexagon. And one of them was red. And I asked the guy, what would you do if one of these dots turned red? And he said, well, that would be a database connection pool thread lock, and I'd have to do something about it, like call this other person, whatever. And I was like, well, it's right there. And I'm trying to wonder, why isn't the whole dashboard turning red? Because that is a very, very, very important signal, and people tend to ignore things when they're running well. We don't really care when they're running well. We want to know what the problems are. The whole screen should have been red, and it said thread pool database connection lock with some details about it that would help people debug. This is observability. It's getting to the point where you are being told by your software what's wrong with it. It's not you having to look at a silly graph like this and interpret. It's you demanding more information because you know. And if you don't know, I'm telling you, your software is already measuring the things you're concerned about. It's just not being surfaced to you. So One way we're putting observability into motion is through the Sauce Labs continuous testing benchmark. We're able to take signals that we're already getting from your testing and feed you back information about how successful it is. If you heard QuickBase, they told you they got an A+ on their continuous testing benchmark score. That's awesome. It's amazing because they're paying attention to the signals that we are now giving them. We've run 3 billion tests on this system, and finally we're feeding this information back to you about how it's actually going. So, engineering and development, marketing and business analysts, executive champions, you should all start asking questions about this kind of metric you could be getting out of your own system. So observability at its heart is not that easy, but it is transformational in terms of the amount of confidence you get from your system when you build it into your system. You get predictability. Release and rollback confidence. I mean, I'm sure anyone who's been in the industry for a fair amount of time understands that when you release software, usually it's a series of commands that you have to run at a command line in order to deploy. Even though we are in the world of CI/CD right now, we're not all doing it, right? You have to go through a script, you have to go through some stuff, and then you have to make sure that it's all working, and then you cross your fingers, you hold your nose, you hit the button, and then you watch. And then if it rolls, if you do have to roll the release back, it's a bad day because you have to rebuild the software, do a git reset hard to a previous commit, do all the scripts again. And then if there's a database column that was added during the last release, God help you, because you now have to do something about that, the change to the database schema, which your old software won't be able to match. Anyway, it was a nightmare. Feature flags have all but solved that problem if we do that successfully. Feature flags are a piece of observability. Instrumentation, making sure that logging is done correctly, or that open tracing or some kind of tracing that you do is recording the events correctly, or installing New Relic. All of these are elements of observability. You can't just wake up one day and build observability into your system. It requires a huge amount of interwork between teams and sort of a change in the cultural questions that the team asks each other and the accountability that they hold each other to. So I wanted to talk a little bit about monitoring and give you some examples of when you see a situation, you should be able to tweak your thinking a little bit to start asking a slightly better question. So if you're monitoring, you'll see that 362 of 1,258 tests failed. I'm just pulling these numbers out of the air. I'm sure I've been in this situation before. So you're being told 362 tests failed. You're not being told anything else. If your system had observability, you'd be told there was an API endpoint that was down that was a root cause of 80% of these 362 failures. There is no reason our software should not be able to tell us that. So let's look at a case where every test is passing, everything's good. Well, are you getting any insights out of it when your test is passing? I already said it and you know it to be true. If all the tests are green, nobody pays attention. Also, if too many tests are red, nobody pays attention. So if all the tests are green, what if we could tell you there's a big amount of overlap between your tests? Suite optimization, that is something that we're thinking about right now. We could tell you what kinds of clustering of functionality that you have, like you're hitting these URLs over and over and over and over and over again. You're hitting them the same way. You're not actually testing anything net new with these number of tests, or by saying you have 600 tests that run through the same 6 steps in their opening salvo. Could you potentially abstract that via an API call and remove those from the UI consideration, and that would speed up everything, because we all know that UI tests run a little bit more slowly than API tests. But the point is that Sauce Labs and you have all of this information already. It's just a matter of surfacing it, making it observable. Now let's look at another metaphor for like a real world situation. Passenger capacity is under 5% for this flight. I mean, just in monitoring, that's alarming. But if the system was observable, it would be telling you there's a pandemic and it's causing international travel bans. So what we're trying to do is talk about where does it go in, because we always talk about the infrastructure, but it actually is about the user journey. It's about understanding what users are doing and transforming the culture of our team to make sure that we understand how to ask these questions better. Because monitoring is an action that you perform in order to mitigate risk. It is a piece of observability, but it's a thing that you do in order to mitigate risk. If you get observability into your system, it's a characteristic that your system possesses. It's a noun, and it lowers risk to begin with. It doesn't just help you account for risk after the fact. It lowers your risk because you're all able to see the problems all at once. Your system is testable. It's instrumented. So let's talk about risk. Everything we do in this business can be quantified in terms of risk. The risk of doing it or not doing it, the risk of something being late, the risk of something being low quality, the risk of something being the wrong thing, shipping the wrong product. Even though you thought it was the right product, you had market research, you had focus groups, you could still be shipping the wrong thing. People do it all the time. And there's also the risk of the market shifting. That's harder to account for, but it is possible. So the assignment from what I'm talking about today is the next time you deal with an issue, don't talk about it in terms of this thing broke. Talk about it in terms of the risk to the user and how you could make the system more observable in exposing it. So inserting a non-printable character in this field displays an unattractive .NET stack trace to the user. If I do, a strange, like if I put an emoji inside of a text field or a Klingon character, something like that, it'll display a stack trace. Most developers that I've worked with in the past, they see that and they think, not a big deal. And it might not be a big deal, but you at least need to identify the risk associated with it. Because if you insert a non-printable character and you see the .NET stack trace, it allows nefarious users to fingerprint your system. And now nefarious users now know that you're running a .NET server, and they might be able to follow the OWASP top 10, or at least, or even get a hold of a zero-day security issue that tells them that certain unpatched .NET servers have a particular vulnerability that can be exploited by doing this. And since they have spidered your site and they understand that these errors exist all over your site, and they might just take a shot that you haven't patched your server yet, and they'll start to target that as a vector to hack your system. So if you as a tester only identify that it displays an unattractive stack trace, you won't get listened to or heard the way you would if you actually say, this is a security risk inherent in our system. You still might not want to fix it, but we at least need to identify it and talk about the risk that it poses. That way people will hear you. So how does this lead to Sauce Labs? What we're trying to do is bring observability at risk and the shift right concept to our roadmap for the next year or two. In the past, Sauce Labs has been used more or less like just a basic Selenium grid, where you use us to execute tests. What we're trying to do now, and I'm where I need to speed up, is we're trying to encourage a little bit of smoke tests in production, functional performance security testing. We need to integrate Sauce with monitoring, and we already have a prototype for this as an open source, an integration with Sentry to deliver root cause analysis back to Sauce Labs. I believe I have a link on here somewhere. And then there's the idea of testing analytics post-release, which is a thing that you can already do in Sauce Labs. We're trying now to bring that to our mobile platform. And then testing the full analytics pipeline, which we can't do for you, but we can at least advise you on how to do, making sure that not only do the analytics events get fired off, but that they actually land in the right place for your business intelligence people. And then correlating the UI tests with monitoring, using analytics to then inform requirements back. There are a number of companies that we're looking at partnering with that do this kind of work. And then using analytics to generate tests, that is the holy grail, which I'm more and more convinced every day is the right answer, and it's not necessarily possible with the technology we have at the moment. So where do we as testers fit? We really need to find out what the money wants. What does the money want? I probably am stealing Titus Fortner's thunder by putting this slide in here, because it's always in his slide text, and I apologize, Titus. But what I want you to do is understand what your business cares about the most. At my former e-commerce company, we would lose money if, when you clicked on a coupon, we did not get the proper attribution that we referred you to the site that we were sending you to. And we found, my CEO of my company learned my name when I found a problem where several code paths prevented that from happening on certain browser configurations. Because I stopped testing the profile and I started working on the main thing that earned us money. So the more you talk about observability, and not just using the word, but actually talking about how to make the system observable and useful, the more people in product engineering will hear you. And the more you talk about risk, the more executives will hear you. I believe, and I've been in QA for 20 years, so I can make this with a little bit of authority. I believe that the reason that testers feel less relevant than they actually are is because we have missed out on the conversation about risk, for the most part. That is a generalization, does not apply to everyone, but it applies to a lot of people and a lot of conversations I've been in. If we don't talk about risk, we are surfacing defects in kind of an academic way for no real good reason. We need to talk about the effects this will have on the users when these issues make it to production. We are the glue that ties the user to the engineering group. We are the last frontier before they get the software that they need, before they get to do the task that they came here to do. And my challenge to everyone here is to start using the language of risk to make sure that you get heard better. I don't know if we have any time for questions, but I certainly want to thank everyone for attending and paying attention.